Yeah. Good morning and welcome, and thank you for agreeing to speak to us today. And I'll just repeat what I said to the others. Some of the questions will be to the whole panel, but please don't feel that you have to answer all questions, all of you. Obviously, if you feel there's something you wish to add or subtract from what a previous speaker has said, feel free to do so. But we haven't really got time for any unnecessary repetition. Perhaps you'd just like to introduce yourself for voice transcription purposes, starting with you, Heather.
Yes, my name is Dr. Heather MacGregor. I own and run an executive search company in London. I'm a founder and member of the steering committee of the 30% Club. I also have written recently a careers book for women called Careers Advice for Ambitious Women. And finally, in the interest of full disclosure, following the previous witnesses, I should tell you that I both have physics A-level and I qualified as a pilot at 48 years old.
Thanks very much.
I'm Dr. Catherine Hakim. I'm a social scientist. I've been doing research on women and women's employment issues, women and the family, and all the issues related to women for 20, 30 years. I've published 2 books which are particularly relevant to this inquiry. One is Key Issues in Women's Work, and the other one is Work-Lifestyle Choices in the 21st Century. Both of them focus on the current situation and address the choices that women make in terms of their preferences and their behaviour and so on in the modern 21st century workforce, and both of them are entirely based on reviews of the most recent research results, and that's what I generally focus on, is the current situation looking forward rather than looking backward.
Thank you. Mike Buchanan.
Yes, Mike Buchanan, Chief Executive of the Campaign for Merit in Business and author of The Glass Ceiling Delusion.
Steve Moxon.
Steve Moxon. I'm a non-affiliated, completely independent, cross-disciplinary researcher into the biological roots of human sociality, particularly interested in the sexes. I've only recently started being published in 2008, published in science journals, and also through an imprint academic, a book called The Woman Racket, the new science explaining how the sexes relate.
Thank you. Right, I'll just open the question to Mike Buchanan to start with. Your organisation states that men are more likely to become engineers and women are more likely to become nurses. Why do you think that?
I think the roots of it, I believe, are biological. I'm very much persuaded by the work of Professor Simon Baron-Cohen at Cambridge University, who published a book called The Essential Difference back in 2003. And his essential thesis is that most people, if you like, are gender typical. That the male brain is designed for systemizing, and the female brain for empathizing. And if that's true, and I think there's a lot of evidence that it's true, then we would expect men to be more interested in physics, in mathematics, in engineering, and we would expect women to be more interested in nursing and medicine and indeed psychology.
I'm not sure, and perhaps we should have Mr. Bowen Cohen, or whatever his name was, in front of us. Could you just summarise what you said about the male and female brain?
Yes, his thesis is basically that evolution has led to the male of the species, if you like, being hardwired, having a brain that's hardwired for systemizing. So having an interest in systems, how to improve them, how to change things around. Whereas women, for evolutionary psychological reasons, their focus is more around relationships. And we even find in the business world that women talk a great deal more about interpersonal relationships than we see men doing. So men, if you like, I think are task-driven in a sense, and women far more likely to be people-driven. And it's my thesis that as you go towards the top of major organisations, and particularly private sector organisations, that being good at systemising gives a natural advantage over being good at empathising.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how that would relate to why women should not be good engineers or good physicists.
Yes, I'm not saying
there's
I'm not saying
evidence.
Sorry, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be.
Yeah.
I'm simply saying that the number of men who would be good mathematicians, good physicists, good engineers will naturally considerably outnumber the number of women who are.
Yeah. I'll bring in Anna. I think is got a point on this.
You may be overemphasising a potential small biological changes to that of cultural changes. If we look at physicists, for example, if you visit countries in the Middle East, you'll actually find a large number of physics graduates are female. In Iran, 2/3 of physicists are female. There are many other cultural barriers to women in those countries, but yet in that particular area, it's not a barrier. So I would suggest to you perhaps it's more the cultural influences that would have are the reason why women would tend to move into certain professions or occupations, as opposed to something which is based on scientific biological factors.
Well, I can't talk for Iran, forgive me, but my experience in 30 years in the business world was that I don't know 80-90% of men and women do act gender typically. You know, given the same choices, they will given the same options in life. They will very often.
But what I'm trying to say is, what's the difference between the cultural factors and the scientific factors? Because you've quoted one piece of evidence to the exclusion of anything else, and you seem to suggest that there is a rational scientific basis for your conclusion. And what I'm suggesting to you is that perhaps the reason is actually primarily a cultural one rather than a biological one.
But it could be argued, and I think there's someone on this panel who would argue it rather better than I, that culture results from biology. But you know, at the end of the day, the biological side of all this, I know it's contentious, but it's not part of our case at Campaign for Merit in Business as to why increasing gender diversity on boards in particular is a dangerous thing. I mean, the core of our argument is that there are 5 longitudinal studies showing that that when you improve, in inverted commas, gender diversity on boards, financial performance declines, and there is not a single robust study that says that when you do that, performance improves.
Right, and how many people are members of the Campaign for Merit in Business?
There's probably about 10 people, but you know, we've been going about 6 months.
Okay, thank you very much.
These 5 longitudinal studies, are they published?
Oh, indeed, yes. 4 of them are actually in the written submission that we provided.
Right.
A fifth has since turned. We've since discovered a fifth, and have that with me today. We're very happy to hand it out to people.
And no doubt we will look at them. Can I bring in Robin Walker?
So, Mike, you dismissed a gender pay gap as a statistical artefact.
Yes.
I just wonder if you can expand on what exactly you mean by a statistical artefact and why it should be that rather than many of the other things we've heard about in our evidence.
I think it's very clear when you actually look at these studies that suggest a sizable gender pay gap. If you actually dig down into them, you'll find there's an awful lot of comparing different things. So, I mean, one example in the study that I saw from some years ago was comparing male and female salespersons, and they actually compared, if you like, sales representatives who work on the road and probably do 100,000 miles a year, with shop assistants, and they're regarded as comparable, or they will take a particular job. You know, quite apart from that, they won't take account of the fact that very often the responsibility and the budgets and so on, or the number of staff, is very often, you know, rather more for male managers than for female managers. You know, so issues like that tend to be discounted, but when you actually include that in the mix, the gender balance all but disappears.
But surely there are issues. I mean, some of the issues you've already talked about different choices of careers and people being able to stick for different periods of time to a career, about a career break and so on and so forth, which also have an effect and are to do with different genders. I mean, surely you can't dismiss those as purely statistical artefacts.
No, but you would expect, surely, I mean, to my mind, you know, when somebody takes, you know, a number of years, let's say, out of the workplace, it's obvious that will impact on their career prospects. And the majority of these things are actually choices, which Catherine, I know, will hopefully talk about.
And just coming back to your suggestion earlier that, fundamentally you're suggesting that women have better people skills and men are more systematic in their approach to things. Surely in a lot of large organisations, people skills and actually management of people is a hugely important and valuable skill. And surely when you're talking about the composition of boards, that is something that you'd want to see reflected at board level to a degree.
Indeed, but at the end of the day, if these people skills translated into the bottom line, as was claimed for a great many years, we would have longitudinal studies which show that. But we have 5 studies that show that despite the theory about people skills and soft skills and all the rest of it, it doesn't translate into the bottom line. And quite the opposite. It actually translates into a decline in corporate performance.
I want to just have one more supplement to ask Heather. Obviously, with the work that you've been doing with the 30% Club, there must be a number of senior directors there who disagree with these longitudinal studies and take a different view, and a number of company boards that see value in having a proportion of women. I was wondering where they feel that they're getting their evidence from.
Yes, I think it's very difficult to link any kind of board to financial performance. I think that any longitudinal study that tries to do that, I think you'll find is quite ambitious, and as we all know, with real life data, there's lots and lots of things that can change. 30% Club is actually much more concerned about the effectiveness of boards, and that doesn't necessarily mean financial performance. Financial performance will be heavily dependent on the CEO. And we believe that more women on boards will deliver a more effective board. And apart from anything else, for many companies, women are lots and lots of their customers, for instance. So, I think it makes a lot of sense that Roberts Funnell has a lot of women on the board of Marks & Spencer, and that's the kind of thing we'd like to see.
Have you read these longitudinal studies that Mike Buchanan has talked about? If so, have you any comments on them?
While I believe that Mr. Buchanan is referring to the study in Norway, I don't know because he hasn't said so. The study in Norway, where they have had quotas, Mr. Chairman, shows that there has been no change in the financial performance of companies despite the fact that they now have 40% of women on boards. The 30% Club interest in the Norway experience is very much around the fact that despite quotas, we still haven't got a sustainable pipeline of women in executive positions. So despite the fact that you have this wonderful headline of 40% of women on boards, you don't have either a pipeline of senior women or women CEOs. In fact, their average for both of those statistics are lower than a European-wide average.
Okay. Can I bring in Anne McKechnie?
Yes, this is a question to Catherine, Mike and Steve. All of you have theories about the presumption of innate differences between men and women. And I just wondered if you could each explain your theories surrounding that presumption. Perhaps I could ask Catherine to start us off.
I have been misrepresented in that I don't think the innate differences are of any consequence whatsoever at all. I think they have mattered in the past. All the latest research shows that there are no important, and that's the key thing, not whether they're statistically significant, which academics like to boast about because that's as far as they ever get, but whether they're important differences between male and female abilities. There are none anymore. And there are none in their activities, behaviour, interests, whatever, except in 3 areas which I think everyone is now agreed seem to be permanent. One is men are more aggressive, and aggressive in a very wide general way, meaning they also can be very more motivated in activities that they undertake. They can be more violent and so on and so forth. That seems to be immutable and universal and permanent. It's not changing. The second is men are much more interested in sex, so sexual differences in terms of interest and activity and so on. And the third one is spatial intelligence, which does explain very, very, very particular occupations. There are more male architects, for example, and that seems to be likely to continue. But there are very, very particular occupations where spatial, the ability to rotate things in 3-dimensional space is important. most occupations it's not really going to be important. So I don't think any innate differences, which are certainly there in terms of brain science, the latest results, I don't think they actually matter in an everyday, ordinary workplace, daily life, in any important way. That's the key thing, in any important way. Society today is man-made, the workforce is man-made, and the kinds of careers that men and women choose to have are, if you like, man and women made. So my research is simply looking at the choices that men, my focus originally was primarily on women. I then extended the research to men as well. The choices that women and the preferences they express in the current day after the equal opportunities revolution gave women real choices in the labour market and in the educational system. That was the first thing. And after the contraceptive revolution, didn't constrain women's choices because they could never control when they fell pregnant if they were sexually active. Mm-hmm. And the pill was the key point, in my view, the most important change in history for women, because it gave them independent control of their fertility, independent of men, whereas other forms of contraception don't have that independence. So after the 60s with the contraceptive revolution, after the 70s with the equal opportunities revolution, and after a whole pile of other changes in the labour force, of creation of jobs for secondary earners, more flexibility, etc., a variety of things which are in the handout, which I hope has been given to you, I think you get a significant change in the situation that women encounter, and they have genuine choices to make. In that context, the choices and the preferences they expect, they state in all the research, this is for all modern liberal industrial societies, it's not just Britain, more or less set out in a sort of ideal type classification in table 2 of the handout, which I hope you have, and it shows that roughly 20% of women in all societies are work-centred careerist in the way men are. Roughly 20% of women are home-centred, family-oriented in the way that very, 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 very few men are, and roughly 60% are in the middle, wanting the best of both worlds, a combination of family work, family life, and paid employment, success or achievement in the public sphere, whether it's in politics, sport, art, workplace, whatever. So the middle group are the ones that are always dominant in any survey results because they're the ones who are most numerous. But an awful lot of policy is based on the assumption that women would be careerist and work-centred just like men if only culture, society allowed them to. And the evidence is they simply aren't. And I mean, just one example, and that's why I've added table 3 at the back of the handout, is Sweden has had gender equality policies for decades longer than any other country in Europe. They've been more persistent and insistent on them than any other country, and not just Sweden, the other Nordic countries generally, but Sweden is usually the main example. Even in Sweden, in the modern age, only a third of women choose to be full-time, continuously employed in whatever activity they do. And that is within the range that I say in my overall classification, that the range, the proportion of women who are careerist, work-centred, varies from 10% in countries where the whole culture, policy, and everything is totally anti-women working, but the maximum is never more than around a third of women, even in countries and cultures that are totally in favour of gender equality. So there is a limit to the proportion of women who are going to be interested in ambitious careers. And of course, the sort of people who are going to come to this committee and give evidence, and the sort of people who are in academia, and the sort of people who are in top jobs, are always going to be taken from that group. Now, that group is much bigger for men, but there are substantial numbers of women as well, but it's a much smaller group as a proportion of all women. And so you will always hear from these women who very often completely lose sight, understandably, of the fact that actually there are a lot of other women whose attitudes to jobs and careers is completely different. And the home-centred group never has a voice There's virtually no organisation.
Can I just possibly just stop
gives
you
them
there?
a voice,
Because I mean,
they're never heard.
Can I just stop with the figures? Because the figures, if you look at Sweden, is family-centred 4% compared to about 17% in the UK. So clearly issues around childcare would suggest are actually the predominant reason about perhaps why people end up staying at home, particularly if you're low income. And we've got a very high percentage of people low incomes compared to other Western countries. There also is, if I also just about to finish the point, is that in terms of the adaptive sector, there are far more men, younger men now, who actually want to spend more time with their younger children, and that's an increasing social phenomenon. And I know people, I'm sure everyone around this room knows of people who now want to spend more time with their children, young children who are men, that actually if they are also able to get flexibility, that more of them are likely to move into the adaptive section. So, what I would suggest to you is that this primarily cultural and obviously social policies like childcare in particular improved or flexibility is improved, those figures will actually move quite considerably.
Well, they're not moving, and they haven't moved for a long time. And these are the statistics for the British survey on preferences, what they want to do. It's not necessarily what they are doing. So there are women who prefer to stay at home full-time, who are working out of financial necessity. There are women who are working full-time, who would really prefer to be at home. And there are women who are in part-time jobs who would prefer to have...
I would suspect that most women are working because they need to work to actually pay their bills and look after their families. And given the fact that actually when you start to look at where the average wage is for women and for most families, it's pretty inevitable that that's a conclusion you'll come to, and that's the predominant reason why people go out to work.
The reason everybody works is to earn money. That is what is the nature of paid employment, is that it's done for remuneration and not for pure fun. So everybody works for money, men as well. So there's no news in that. The point I'm simply making is if you look at the research evidence on preferences, women have different pattern of preferences, which is not to say that all women want to be housewives and all men want to be high achievers in the workforce, but there is a different pattern between men and women, and you get it even in a country like Belgium, which again has very strong gender equality policies for a very long time, and there is a different pattern of preferences. There's also a different pattern of actual employment as well. You get it in countries like Holland as well. Yeah. The figures are a bit different.
There are changes also in social trends, more men wanting to take part in childcare, less connection with religious ideologies. I mean, there are changes which are also going across that pattern.
There are cultural changes that make it more acceptable for men to say that they want to spend more time with their family. But what is consistent for quite a long time now, for about 20, 30 years, is all surveys that have asked people about their working hours preferences, and this of course covers men as well as women, show that the majority of people who work full-time say they want to work shorter hours. And that has been going on consistently for as long as surveys have been asking that question. So what reason they give for wanting to work shorter hours is almost irrelevant. Everybody says they want to work shorter hours if that's a possibility.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'll Steve.
The question of the level of analysis here, I think everything that Catherine's just said is very accurate. The data is very comprehensive. Might raise Simon Baron-Cohen's theory about male brain. These are on different levels. My view is you have to start from the bottom, you have to start from the biology. If you think of culture has evolved, it's evolved to function, to feedback, to fine-tune and reinforce the underlying biology. So it's not separate from biology, it's just a manifestation of it. In fact, it reveals ever more what's fundamental about the biology, even though the biology itself does in a sense. So you have to start, and if you start from top-down theories, as with most sociology, you're starting from ideological premise, and all you're doing is going around in circles in a tautology. So you have to start from the biology. And the basis of the biology is there a major difference in the sexes? You're damn right there is. The male functions, there's various ways of conceptualising it. The one I sort of favour is talk in terms of a genetic filter function. The fundamental problem in any biological system is to deal with the accumulation of gene replication error, mutations, recombination. Males compete with other males to sort out the men from the boys, as it were. Females preferentially sexually select the higher mate value, the higher status males, i.e. the males of higher rank in the male dominance hierarchy, and also the self-suppression of fertility and sex drive in the lower status males. So that functions. That's the whole point of any social system, is to stop most males from reproducing either at all or to any great extent. Now, if you then look, how does that translate into human sociality, human social structure and dynamics? We know, and this is no dispute in science literature, from a toddler age, males form a dominance hierarchy. Females don't. Of course, you can cut across all this and pretend that the sexes are the same. But if you go looking for differences, you will find that males form a dominance hierarchy, females form what's been generally dubbed a personal network. Now, when you get into the workplace, when you get adults, a workplace is, if you like, a socially amorphous rendition of the male dominance hierarchy. It necessarily is a hierarchy for obvious reasons we don't need to go into. So males fit into that very well. Females obviously don't. But it gets even worse, if you like, than that, because there is a sex dichotomy as well in in-grouping psychology. Male in-group psychology tends to identify with any conceptual group, such as your university year group, your work group indeed, right? Whereas female in-grouping psychology is very much tied into this personal network. So it becomes, by extension, out from family and friends in a chain, and that cuts across, again, the workplace. So it's no surprise that women have difficulty in the workplace, and not only do they have difficulty, but they don't want to be in it in the first place. There are all sorts of ways you can come at this. But the upshot, if you then measure, if you look at any attribute, any competence or anything you can measure between the sexes, you tend to get very different normal distribution curves. That is, if you plot a distribution of all the variance within one sex, the male curve is like this. It's fat, both at the top and the bottom. You get the geniuses and the dunces, relatively flat in the middle. The female distribution curve tends to be like this, so it disappears to asymptotes very quickly at both the top and bottom tails, and most of the individuals are clustered around the median in the middle. Now, so if you look say this is a top tail, you look across there, what you've got a fat male tail, the female tail's already disappeared. So this is what we're talking about at board level in a commercial corporation organisation. This is why you do get, it turns out, that a ratio of something like 10 to 1 males to females. There is nothing you will ever do to get rid of that. Yes, you can, as Mike's pointed out, you can always get non-executive women onto boards, and that's probably a good thing in some ways. But there hasn't been any, since the Davis report, there haven't been any appointments of executive females, all been non-executives. And you have problems which again emanate from these sex dichotomies. I mean, if presumably the whole point of having women on board is to bring some, how would you call it, womanly qualities, that you're not, the women who compete successfully to get onto board obviously are not typical women. Then you get the sexual dynamics. I mean, when you get men and women together, the basic interaction is not cross-competition, it's sexual display. And males will display their competitiveness. Females will back off from competition. They'll actually reduce their competitiveness. So,
just Mr. Oxford, we are just pressed for time.
Yes,
so
I'll finish
think we've got the guests. Mike, you've already made some comments, but do you want to make any additional? That's fine. Just to ask all the panel, given your various series, do you consider that the Equality Act and the associated legislation is a waste of government resources, or do you think it has a role to play?
I'd say it's a complete waste of resources. I think it's the most extraordinary gravy train. There must be thousands of people riding that gravy train in the UK at the moment, and I think you know they really could do better things with their lives.
Okay, thank you. Steve or Catherine, any comments?
I think you have to have a basic floor of employment rights, including equal opportunities rights and all that kind of legislation in all countries. And there will always be, even in countries where that's taken seriously and people do try to implement it, and in some cases in Europe it's simply written law that everybody ignores. But in a country like Britain where people do actually try to implement it, you will always get cases of backsliding and individual companies or individual people who are inclined to ignore the law, and therefore you have to have mechanisms to enforce it. And I was always in favour of the EOC and similar organisations being there to ensure that there is some kind of compliance, rather than many European countries don't have such a commission, and it's just a law that virtually has no genuine application in reality. So yes, I think it is absolutely essential that you keep it.
Thank you very much.
If I could just add to that, that as somebody who, although I have a PhD, I'm not an academic, I do actually enter the business of putting people into work. That's what I do all day, every day, all year. And a small number of those jobs are for government in this country, and also for not-for-profit organisations such as the Bill and Melinda Gates organisation, the Abraham organisation, and so on. And the Equalities Act has improved, I think, the standard of transparency, the standard of what is required, and in fact we try and apply that throughout all of our work. And so I think that's very relevant. I think, although it's beyond the scope of this committee, Mr. Chairman, I think that what is more relevant in my life is what the Equalities Act has done for black and minority ethnic people. And in 2008, I set up my own 10-week training program to help black and minority ethnic people get their first job, and have personally funded it with the help of some of our clients ever since. This is not a government initiative. And we've had over 100 people through that programme, and we have put 75 of them into meaningful jobs in our sector. So I think that the Equalities Act has really helped that too.
I'd really like to actually add to that. I agree with that sort of point, in that I think the most important problem of equality in the workforce today is concerned with ethnic minorities, migrants and immigration. I just think that is by far the most difficult and important area of policy concern. And I think gender equality has been dealt with. I think the equal opportunities legislation, sex discrimination legislation and all of that has been successful. It's achieved its purpose. It's achieved a pretty level playing field for women. And the focus on occupational segregation and the pay gap is now, I think, a waste of time and misleading, which may have been the question you were meaning to ask, because the pay gap in Britain, anyway, and in the United States, has been completely explained. It's explained in terms of the types of occupations people choose, the hours they work, whether they work in the public sector or the private sector, whether they're union members, not union members, how far the distance travel to work, a whole pile of factors that most studies never look at. And so the overall average difference between men and women in both America and Britain has been completely explained. In a lot of European countries it hasn't been, and therefore the European Commission continues to say it's an issue. But it isn't an issue here. It's been explained. It's very, very small now anyway. So the pay gap isn't an issue.
Sorry, but there
job
has
segregation
been a very
isn't
significant equal pay case this year involving women in the public service in low-paid jobs. That's a very recent example, but it affects thousands and thousands of women across this country. So are you saying that actually that case is really just, has it's done its job, or do you think there aren't any more of these cases around? Because I think most other people actually think there's a lot of these cases still to be examined, and we require transparency to look at it.
There are still cases coming forward which have been a long time in the pipeline, where the equal value criteria and the sex discrimination criteria are applied, and that's why I say you always have to keep that legislation in place, because it's absolutely fundamental. But the current pattern of occupational segregation, which in a way divides into two sorts, vertical and horizontal, I don't think is an issue, because I think on the basis of preference theory, which is it's set out in the handout, to a large extent the current pattern of occupational segregation in this country is the result of choice. And there's a lot of focus on horizontal, like occupational segregation. Women are nurses and men are engineers, and we really ought to change that. But the real important thing is vertical segregation. Why is it men are the top bosses and women are the underdogs, and it's the lack of women to proceed up the occupational ladder that's far more important than which particular type of job they're addressing. So I think that's a separate issue, which
I think sex
remains.
equality should be called sex inequality. Take up what you said about equal value. These cases, I think, are scandalous. It's an attempt to equate, put it crudely, part-time dinner ladies and full-time bin men. It's absolutely absurdity to say, because you put them on the same pay scale, you then retrospectively try to say, well, actually, they're the same job, they should be paid the same. Without accepting that the sexes are fundamentally different, then any attempt at equality legislation will be sex discriminatory against men. And that's actually going on is shown by the most comprehensive study, Reaction Rate 2006. They actually sent out CVs, identical apart from the sex of the applicant, for real jobs. And these are highly male sex typical jobs, systems analyst and accountant. And it's well known that the main stage of discrimination is at the interview stage, between the application and the interview. You are 4 times more likely, the application with a female name on, to get to interview stage. And that speaks volumes. And that's for highly male sex typical jobs. So the problem is the pay gap. If you look to East Germany, that used to be 50, with Catherine will tell you what it is. I mean, the pay gap you would expect to be far larger than it is. I mean, there must be preferencing of women going on for the pay gap to be as small, 18% as it is.
Can I just add one point on that? There was a report recently which pointed out that, something like 60% of undergraduates and graduates these days, I think for the last few years, have been women. And the unemployment rate among new male graduates is 50% higher than that among new female graduates. I suggest there's a sort of gender gap there that might
there's a gender gap in unemployment. Unemployment's risen by women by about 20% in the last 2 years, and it's 1% for men. So it does work in the opposite way.
The latest figures from the ONS show that for every three unemployed women, there are 4 men. And that's 1.08 million versus 1.44.
Yeah, I think we can look at the statistics when we compile the report. Can I bring in Rebecca Harris now?
I'd just like to go back briefly to what Dr. Hakim said and what Mr. Knowlton also picked up on about differences in the pay gap being explained. And you listed a range of reasons for explanation for the pay gap, which are explained and sort of done and dusted, including things like working part-time or whether you're a member of a union. And Mr. Knowlton came in and said it is absurd to equate a full-time bin man with a part-time dinner lady. Now, I think that's quite interesting, because I actually think that one of the things that might be going on here is actually we have a prejudice against part-time work is not real work. For generations we have said that full-time plus is a real job, and part-time is not a real job and therefore doesn't command the same salary regardless of the level of the work. And I just think that there may be some unconscious prejudices you both expressed in that. Anyway,
well, I don't think so.
But anyway, what I'd like to say is if we accept that there are differences in choices, this is really to all of you, how would we use those differences to best improve actually the women's space in the workplace? Because we need it as an economy. We need more women to be fulfilling their potential. We've heard that about in engineering, but in all other parts of the economy, we're in a difficult time. So if we take as given that women make different choices and have different qualities, how can we use that knowledge to actually best improve our economic performance?
Well, one very, very simple way, and I have recommended this myself in books and articles I've published already some time ago, is that the Belgian government introduced a law a long time ago allowing everybody in the workforce to request part-time work for any reason or none. And that was the key thing. It was for any reason or none. And that destigmatized part-time work, because men could apply without having to give a reason, and whether it was to say they wanted to look after their children or any other reason. And I'm not prejudiced against part-time work at all. I've done many studies of it, and it's very important for the female workforce. But it is the case that women are more likely to choose it than men, and that has led to it being stigmatised. And the Belgian law was very much aimed at destigmatising it, because up to then it had always been focused on women working part-time because they had young children or elder care or other family responsibilities, and that was their way of destigmatising it. And in my book on preference theory, I do make recommendations about kinds of policies that make sense. And one of them is for them all to be gender neutral in the way the Belgian one was, and that other policies should try and be even-handed between the three groups of women, and there are also three groups amongst men, although the balance is different, simply because that is fairer all round, rather than what you currently have, which is a focus primarily on the middle group of women who want to combine home and family work and paid employment, or else totally focus on career women. And that's a mixture of policies that very often loses things between the different focuses.
Sorry.
That's right. No, I was going to say that one of the really tough things, I think, for women is going into this career break with wanting to know how they're going to come out the other side. And I think there are lots and lots of women who make a choice to, stay at home for a bit or go part-time, and sometimes they have no choice. After all, it's a great luxury to be able to stay at home, and not everybody has that luxury. And, I think what happens is people don't get appropriate counselling and guidance about a strategy to help them get through that period and out the other side. And in my experience, and every day I'm handling employers who are looking at CVs, and plenty of these CVs have career breaks in them, and I promise you, not one employer over the last 12 years I've been in this job has ever said to me, she went part-time for 3 years, she's clearly not a real person. Okay? That's never, ever happened. I know that's only anecdotal, and I know we only fill 100 jobs a year, but I promise you that's never happened on my watch. And the real difference is, have they stayed current? So I give a number of examples in my book of strategies, and I had one woman come to me. She planned a family of 2, she had a family of 3, which she hadn't planned for. It really meant that she could not do anything else other than stay at home. And I suggested to her that she went and taught part-time in her field, though, and so she did that. She taught 60 or 70 days a year, I think, for the next 3 years. As a result, she stayed completely current on everything in her field, which was very much the stock exchange and accountancy and so forth. And when she was a candidate again for a job of ours, she was absolutely snapped up. But she'd come through the early years and out the other side. And I do think it's about staying current. I also cite the example of Anne Spackman, the comment editor of The Times now, who's a very full-time job now, but who spent years and years as a part-time property correspondent deliberately so that she could write about interest rates and housing when she knew it would be very topical, while raising a family. But at least she remained current. She worked 30 hours a week on average in that time. But it's about staying current, and I don't think that people who have worked part-time are discriminated against.
Can I just press you on? I gathered actually that you have said in your book, Careers Advice for Ambitious Women, that actually employers sometimes view women quite differently, knowing that they may well take time off for
yeah, I think what happens is when employers, that's different. We're talking here about people who've gone part-time for several years, and how do people look at them? People do not look at them differently, provided they have remained current. Okay. The second thing is, how do people look at young women who are a certain age or have, just got married, or people think they might start a family? Yes, I think that people do. I mean, whatever happens, I think people do think in their mind, am I going to... And I'm an employer myself. I employ 22 people, only 2 of them are men. And I think just about almost everybody of childbearing age pretty well has had a child in my office. So I think it's something I'm very used to. And when you are hiring people, you think, how long am I going to have them for before they have a family? But that doesn't necessarily mean you make a decision about make any different decision if they're the best person for the job. What I do say to candidates though is, if you think that there might be that prejudice and this is not candidates for jobs that we're doing particularly, but careers advice I give to everybody. If you think there are some unanswered questions being, if they can't ask you the question under the law, are you planning a family, or have you got adequate childcare? Go in and say it. So, go in and say, look, I know you can't ask me this. I've got 2 children, I've got full-time help, I am completely committed to this career and I want this job. Because they can't ask you that, so go in and say it.
I agree with Heather about it's not about prejudice. I want to agree with Catherine on this one. I mean, to go back to what you said about you're raising possibility of hidden prejudice, comparing a colloquially put part-time dinner lady and full-time binman. I wasn't referring so much to the part and full-time, but obviously a binman is much more onerous. It's a sort of zero status, minus negative status job that men will only take if they're given a pay premium. So I think that the big issue here is that we're focusing on women, and I think we should be focusing more on men. I mean, men, in order to have a life, as it were, you have to somehow display your good genes, gain your status. This does not apply to women at all. Therefore, the problem for unemployment and underemployment with men it should be considered a far more serious problem, because in our PC age, when supposed equality, which isn't, is actually inegalitarianism, we don't have that focus.
Right. I've got one other question I want to ask, but we sort of moved on to what the question I wanted to ask at the end, really, which is partly to Heather. I think Mr. Roxton might be the answer. Is what we think is the potential effect of recent government announcements on improving parental leave for husband fathers might have on attitudes towards either employers in the workplace or actually to men and women themselves in terms of the choices they make. The recent announcements announced last week by Nick Clegg that
yes, about the extra childcare help.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I mean, earlier, I think in the first panel, there was some discussion about the taxation of childcare. It's very true that there has, this has always been a complete barrier to going back to work. When I went back to work after my first child, the nanny earned gross more than I earned net, and so I think that the anything that you can do to take that barrier away.
But this
is
really
about
giving more opportunities, more flexible parental leave for fathers. Specifically, so it is not just necessarily the mother.
Will that help? I think it's, as Catherine said, I think every policy should be gender neutral. In Scandinavian countries, I think you'll still find that the large proportion of people who choose to take it are women, but I think every policy should be gender neutral. And I don't believe that there are differences. I think there might be differences in choice, but I think there are just as many well-qualified women to sit on boards as there are men. I think that people get picked for senior jobs based on their ability, and I think there are just as many able women as men. I think maybe they are not as visible. I think that we need to encourage more women in the pipeline. That's the very next thing we need to address. But I do believe that all of this can be achieved without legislation. And I also believe if you look historically at really important changes that have taken place, so for instance, the combining of chairman and chief executive roles, which was written up in the Higgs report, investor influence brought that to an end. It almost doesn't happen now. And that's a major change. And we can see that kind of change with senior women without legislation.
Can I just add to that? I think the move towards making maternity leave, parental leave, gender neutral is absolutely the right way to go. And I've always argued for gender neutral policies because they otherwise stigmatise women. And it's because women have had the right to maternity leave that employers have been less willing to hire young women of the age when they might have children. And it's absolutely clear on the research for Sweden, the result of giving women effectively 3 years potential maternity leave has been that virtually no women are employed in the private sector. 3/4 of all people working in the private sector are male, and 2/3 of all people working in the public sector are female, because it's the public sector that can cope with that and the private sector has real difficulty. Very, very reluctant to hire particularly young women. And the other effect has been to then, of course, create a gender pay gap in Sweden, which is close to the European Union average and way above the one in Britain. So it's simply not been a good in its effects in terms of the way it's working in Sweden, where very long maternity leave has in practice been reserved for the mother because fathers only get the couple of months. And even when they made it obligatory for fathers to take a couple of months, even then fathers by and large don't take it. So it may still be that mothers will be the ones who take the leave, and use the leave, but employers will never be able to know, and you destigmatise the whole thing about parental leave. And I think that's absolutely the way to go.
But I don't think that would actually make that much difference, because employers will still expect, rightly, accurately, that in only rare cases will men take extended parental leave, whereas in the vast majority of cases it'll be the woman that takes. So it won't actually, it sounds fine in principle, but it won't actually affect any change.
Good. We are running out of time. We've got a number of questions. Could I just ask for brevity in responses to them? Rebecca, have you got any more?
Well, I mean, really, if we accept there are some innate differences, how do we explain the many women who have managed to excel and who've gone past those innate differences, or on the streets of nature like myself who went straight back to work after 2 weeks? How do we explain those differences, and what lessons do we have to learn from them, as I said earlier, which is, for those women who do want to get on, what should they learn? Because we want them to get on, we want them in the workplace if that's where they want to be, because we need it as an economy.
Shall I start?
I think I'm attaching the information I sent to the committee, Mr. a list of the sort of basic things that I have noticed over 12 years, which is written up in my book, that I think that the lessons that women need to learn, and continually developing human capital. It's still the case that 3/4 almost of MBA students, for instance, are men, which means that women get to a certain point and don't continue to build human capital. I think we've talked a lot over the last 2 sets of witnesses about the building of social capital. We heard from Professor Dacre that the building of opportunities to meet other people and build a network were very important. We heard from Claire Walker, my fellow aviator, that the importance of networking was very important. I prefer network as I have to say as a noun rather than a verb, so it is absolutely about building social capital, and one without the other, as students of logic know, is necessary but not sufficient. So you need human capital and you need social capital, both of them together. And I think that also I think that this whole strategy through the early years, and also as Katie Clark said, it's not just children that are issues here. People have parents, sick parents. People also, by the way, have spouses who they have to up sticks and follow to the other side of the world, which mean they have to have a career break. You need a strategy to get through career breaks. It doesn't matter why you have the career break. So these are all the things I think we should be pointing to, and we need more role models. And I think that women who have succeeded have a responsibility to turn around and help the people behind them. And as Madeleine Albright said, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women.
There certainly are. There's good reasons why women succeed in work. I mean, it's fairly well known in research that women tend to be conscientious in comparison to men, and that certainly will get you a long way in work. And of course, what happens then is work and excelling in it becomes an end in itself. It's like a spun-off positive feedback loop, which gets spun off from your fundamental distal motivation. It becomes an end in itself, and that can propel you a long way up the career hierarchy, I think. But as I said, the sexual dynamics are sort of against it. I mean, the core problem is men have a direct motivation to gain status, whereas women don't. I mean, it sounds rather facetious, but I mean, you can see an indirect reason why women would want to propel themselves up a career hierarchy, to put themselves in the path of high-status men. I know that sounds rather facetious, but it's difficult in other way to explain why they would want to actually climb a career hierarchy.
Can I bring Caroline Downage in to complete this?
I have so many questions for so many of you, but I'm just going to ignore you guys and just quickly speak to Heather, if that's okay, because otherwise we'll be here all day. Just really wanted to talk to you about the 30% club, and based on that, just really what measures you think are needed to ensure more women are on senior positions of an organisation, and whether there should be more stringent regulation, things like quotas, in order to up the numbers.
Well, we started the 30% Club 2 years ago. It was founded by a steering committee, which was all female, I have to say. But the members of the club, of which we have 55, are all chairmen of companies. and very few of them are women. They represent 60 companies, between the 55 of them. And we started with 7, so I'm very pleased that we now have 55. And at the time we set it up, of the previous 100 appointments to boards of FTSE 100 companies, 12 had been women. As we sit here today, I mean, it changes every day, this statistic, but since March it's been 55% women. So I think we've made huge progress in 2 years. Now, of course, the actual number of women on boards in the FTSE has only gone from 12.5 to 17.5, but if we continue at this much better, the rate of appointment is the key statistic. If we continue at the rate of appointment, and I confidently predict that this time next year the rate of appointment will be well over 60%, we will get to 30% by 2015, which is what we want to do. And we do believe that this can be achieved without legislation and without quotas. And I could point you to lots of very effective change, from the takeover panel to the Higgs report to all sorts of things that has happened without legislation. So, and actually we believe that quotas is another form of discrimination. So, when Wrexham appoint Joanna Waterous to their board as a senior independent non-executive director, people will say, if there are quotas, she's a woman, that's why she got the job. Well, we don't want that. We want people to look at Joanna Waterous and say, she's the most amazing woman, she was one of the most senior and effective women at McKinsey, she's on 2 other FTSE 100 boards, no wonder she's got that job. No, it's not because she's a woman. And I don't think she was chosen because she was a woman, and I don't want people to think it. So that's why we think we can get there without legislation. We think it'd be a much better way.
Thank you. And that concludes our questioning. I'll repeat what I've said to the other panels. If you feel there's anything you would like to add to the contributions you've made today, please feel free to put it forward in written supplementary evidence. And equally, if we feel there's a question we should have asked but didn't, we may well write to you and we'll be grateful for a reply. But thanks very much. That's very helpful. And we will be taking your comments and considerations and incorporating them in our report in due course.